All right. Well, Linda, thank you so much for being part of our webinar. And we'd just like to start out, tell a little bit about your background and how you got into thinking about testing and accountability and equity issues.
Well, I came into teaching many years ago as a high school English teacher. I taught in big factory model schools on the East Coast in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And I realized very quickly that there were some significant problems that I couldn't overcome as a single teacher in the school. I recognized that the factory model school was not designed for me to care effectively for the 180 kids who would march by 6 periods a day, 30 at a time, without other, teaming and resources and, structures that could allow the collective faculty to do its work. I recognized that I wasn't adequately prepared to teach for all the things I needed and wanted to be able to do, which has led me to do a lot of work on teacher education. And I also recognized that there were huge disparities in funding. One of the places I taught was in Camden, New Jersey, which was before the school finance reforms. More recently, Camden, like other predominantly Black districts in New Jersey, was resourced at about half the level of Princeton and New Brunswick and other places. We did not have books in the book room. We did not have, the resources that were needed for the students who were there. So I've been working on these issues and others for a very long time. More recently, the issues of assessment and accountability have come to the fore really as a function, especially of No Child Left Behind, and the damage that was done by that set of policies we are still, seeking to overcome in these days.
I think just maybe the original, why did we do high stakes testing and accountability? What were we trying to do?
Well,
Why did
George
it
Bush,
fail?
yeah, I think, in the beginning of the Bush administration, right after 9/11, when there was an effort for the Congress to come together around something, the No Child Left Behind bill was on the table. It was based on what was at that time thought to be the Texas miracle, the idea that if you set test score targets and give, punishments to schools that don't meet the targets, somehow, achievement would improve. Later, the Texas miracle was found to be a lot of blue smoke and mirrors because many of the kids who would have scored low on the test were being kept out of testing, were being pushed out of school. I did a study with a colleague on that demonstrated that, the effects were not what they were claimed to be, but the whole country adopted this policy. Most people who voted for the bill hadn't read it. It was clear from the very beginning that there was no way that 100% of schools would become, quote, proficient on a test, and that it would cause a process by which public schools would be declared failing over time. And one of the ideas of the Bush administration at the time was that in any school that was declared failing, parents would then be eligible for vouchers. So it was actually a precursor of the conversation we're having now about vouchers for private school.
So what what are some of the problems with the way we test today?
I think in the United States, we have two major areas of problems around testing. One is the nature of the tests, and the other is the uses of the test. So with respect to the nature of the test, first of all, American testing came from a bell curve framing, which was applied to assessments that came across the ocean, and we changed the underpinnings. So Binet in France was doing assessments of students to see if any students would be unable to benefit from the public schools that were being created at that time. And his conclusion was that most of the kids could do most of the things. And so it was really a criterion notion. Came across the ocean into the hands of Terman at Stanford, I'm sorry to say, who was also a eugenicist, turned it into a bell curve so that you could select items and they would artificially array students along this bell curve so that you could select and sort them. And he had very strong ideas about who should be at the top and who should be at the bottom. He published extensively about the, intellectual deficits of Eastern Europeans and as he put it, Indians, Mexicans, and Negroes who could be siphoned off into menial tasks, but could not, learn from the traditional schooling curriculum, and on and on. So the the girls outscored boys on the first test. He said, well, that's wrong. So he changed the test. So the boys would be at the top and the girls would not. So, the test was manufactured to create the bell curve, to create a way by which the items would select and sort in the ways that were considered, quote, appropriate at that time. So, and we still have the bell curve philosophy underpinning almost all our tests, even the ones that are supposed to be criterion referenced. This idea that we can array people on a single dimension from top to bottom and figure out who's better and who's worse. The second thing that came into American testing was artificial methods, the idea that we could use multiple choice questions and that those would be more efficient. We can score them with scantrons. Where do you go in the world where any of the tasks you ever have to encounter require you to pick one answer out of 5 that somebody's already given you? It's just not a way that we actually learn and do work in the world. And then those were designed to have distractor questions that were intentionally to fool, kids and so on. And then, of course, they're rooted in a view of what the experience base or the world would be. And again, there's lots of opportunity for bias there, and that has been demonstrated in many, many ways. And then there's also this assumption that standardization gets you the most accurate answers about kids. But if you are, for example, on the SAT asking about a ship is to X as a fish is to a school, and the answer is regatta, that's going to be known to, Northeastern kids with privilege and not to other kids. If you had asked a question about a piñata rather than a regatta, you would have given more access to other students. So this notion that accurate measurement is somehow culture blind and can be standardized is another problem that we have. So we have a lot of problems with our tests, and they've been talked about for many years. But the other big problem that makes those problems more problematic is that we're using the test for selecting and sorting and punishing and sanctioning. And that means that there's a lot more attention to trying to replicate in the school, in the classroom, what's on the test in the way that it's on the test. Furthermore, it's a misuse of tests, as the psychological standards for testing make clear. We should not be making decisions about anything based exclusively on a test score, and even primarily on a test score. So I think we're in a situation where we've got inadequate tests being used for inappropriate purposes. And so when we think about where we have to be moving, we need to take into account what we now know from the science of learning and development, that people actually have multiple talents and multiple ways of learning and multiple ways of demonstrating their learning. We see that in universal designs for learning and other areas that are coming consciousness about how to maximize the learning that people do, how to get, back to where Benet was. Almost all the kids can do almost all the things because we've taught and assessed in ways that demonstrate and enable that kind of learning. So if we really want to get to instructional useful assessments that are also supportive of equity, we need to, first of all, move past the bell curve. We need to really design assessments that are based on the things we want kids to actually know and be able to do, and that assess those in more authentic ways that allow students to demonstrate what they know and are able to do, and that actually better test, better evaluate higher order thinking skills and problem solving skills and collaboration skills and all the things that people really need in the real world. That also allow choices, and contextualization of the tasks. So, for example, in a number of countries, first of all, they assess less frequently than we do. The sort of assessments for public reporting and management of decision making in the policy world happen at most once in elementary school, once in middle school, and then again in the high school. The assessments are often very authentic, where For example, in the UK, for the English um, quote exams in high school, there's a whole set of activities kids are going to do. They're going to, write a persuasive essay. They're going to um, develop a narrative. They're going to do some kind of, fictional and non-fictional writing. All of those things, like in the International Baccalaureate program, are evaluated by teachers, and they're rolled up together into an assessment. Kentucky used to have a writing portfolio before the Bush administration made all of the states get rid of their performance assessments. And they basically, teachers were part of designing it. Kids could choose the topics about which they would write their persuasive essay or their whatever their task was. There was a common standardized rubric that could be scored in a reliable way, and teachers got to a place where they could score these at 0.99% reliability. There were lots of assessments of that, but it was embedded in the work. The kids didn't feel like they were taking a test, they were writing a paper. And then their products were, evaluated. There were scientific investigations in states like, Connecticut and Vermont, which is like what we see in Singapore and Australia and the UK today, where kids would design a scientific undertaking, and they would, use the scientific method and be evaluated. There were common tasks that would engage students often together in doing an inquiry around. I remember one from Connecticut where they had to figure out how to build a statue in the town square that would withstand acid rain, because that was a big deal at that time, and they had to test the materials and come up with their evaluation, collect data and evaluate the data. Those are the kinds of things that kids are going to need to do in the real world outside of school. They're going to actually prepare them for college. We actually have evidence that in schools that use these kinds of assessments, often in a portfolio for graduation, that students are better prepared and do better in college than students who've grown up without that kind of opportunity to learn in ways that are engaging, that allow them to engage in deep learning, that allow them to learn the skills that they're going to need to use to be efficacious themselves. So we need assessment systems that are reinforcing those things, that are part of the teaching and learning process. We need teachers to be part of the design and evaluation of the assessments, with time, set aside for that to happen as part of what is the teacher's work. And then we need to use the assessments for information and improvement, not for punishment and sanctions.
So, initially when the system was instituted, I mean, there was talk of inequities. There was talk of children who fell through the gaps of low-income schools where kids were far behind. And the idea was, we need to make sure all third graders are on, third grade reading level. And, it was really, I mean, there was talk of reducing inequities. But I know you and your daughter have recently published a book that really thinks about education through an equity lens, and some of the ways that schools continue to be inequitable. And with Awesome Voices, we think about that a lot. Has testing really reduced inequities? Can the kind of testing we've had do that? Or, what are some other approaches to reducing inequities in education?
Well, testing may provide some measures that allow people to advocate for change, but it in and of itself does not produce change. And it's kind of like weighing the cow over and over again instead of feeding it. You're not going to get a healthier cow by just doing that. You have to really think about what is the environment. And really, if we think about what accountability should be, accountability should actually be the government as a whole thinking about what needs to happen so that kids can learn effectively, so that we enhance good practices, that we identify and eliminate bad practices, and that we have continuous improvement. So there are many things that actually go into learning, of course, and we're in a highly inequitable society for many, many years. I mean, this is not a new thing, but also in part because of prior discrimination. We have areas of cities that are very toxic, where redlining used to keep investments out. based on race and discrimination. And so there are places where kids are very exposed, overexposed to a variety of toxins, pollution, et cetera. And those actually undermine learning. The Flint water crisis of some years ago, we think of it as how horrible that was, that basically, a whole city was being poisoned and kids were, many students became lead poisoned and still have, all kinds of cognitive needs that were caused by the environmental hazard. But that's not an uncommon story. We have all across the country kids, getting lead in their water, getting all kinds of toxins that have not been handled. So there's the first thing is you need a healthy environment. You need an environment that is not only free of toxins, but also that is free of violence and stressors, because those all impact learning as well. Secondly, you need equitable resources for schools, and 38 states still don't have that, where the kids who have the greatest needs and who are societally disadvantaged in other ways, like those I just mentioned, in communities, in families with not enough resources. Most of our students in public school now are low income. That's because we're not taking care of children adequately in the society. And then on top of that, we usually layer inadequate resources. So the schools that serve the most needy kids are often getting the least resources to meet their needs. Then we need to be sure that in those schools we have a very safe and inclusive environment where students are being enabled to succeed. Community schools are one of the things that can support that environment, because you have the wraparound services, and you also have ideally a design in the school that is paying attention to students' needs and ensuring that they get what they need, and that educators have the resources to be sure that those needs are being met. Also, reducing exclusionary discipline, or, for goodness sakes, physical discipline. Corporal punishment still goes on in a lot of schools, and replacing it with what we know to be very effective positive disciplinary practices, restorative practices that in fact reduce bullying, reduce violence and vandalism in schools, and attach kids to a caring school community. And then we need, of course, high quality teaching, which means we have to support teachers well in terms of both their preparation and the mentoring that they get and the supports they get for their professional learning, but also in terms of the compensation that they receive, which can keep them in a profession, that needs them to stay. And then finally, we need, a very thoughtful, deeper learning curriculum, which often has been allocated to a very small minority of students through gifted and talented programs or advanced placement or other kinds of courses that kids get selected into. Those often also reveal the inequities in the system, rather than recognizing that many of the things that are taught in those courses are appropriate for all kids, and actually bringing a thinking curriculum to everyone. That again is part of the select and sort mentality that goes back to the factory model founding of our schools 100 years ago. We've got to design schools now for the next 100 years around what we know about learning and development and what we know about the requirements for equity.